area of family financial planning and financial security, in the betterment and the improvement and the increasing the viability of public education, and in the investigation and inculcation of integrity and ethics in private and public life. Sister Madrian, if you'd start, I'll act as an informal timer. We will have time for questions. You can speak either place, I think. You're probably more busy.
As tall as the rest of you. So I've been asked to talk about financial security, something about which I've done a little bit of research. So individuals have a lot of different financial needs. In addition to day-to-day living expenses, there are any variety of major purchases people need to save for: buying a home, buying a car, sending their kids to college, sending their children on mission, insuring against economic risks like unemployment or healthcare crises, and my own personal favorite is saving for retirement. I'm hoping to get there one day. But there's a lot of evidence that people don't do very well at many of these tasks. Now, I'm probably preaching mostly to the choir. To those of you in this room, I suspect no one here needs a lesson on how to do better on all of these tasks, but I think you are the exception rather than the rule. If you look at the U.S. personal savings rate, in 2005, it turned negative for the first time. And to put that in retrospect, back in 1970, that number was something like 10%. Individuals were saving about 10% of their income. It's been declining steadily over that time period. And one of the things that struck me most when my husband was called to serve as a bishop in Chicago many years ago was how much of his time was spent helping individuals not with their spiritual problems, but with their financial problems. So it's an interesting question to ask: why are individuals doing so poorly when it comes to saving and keeping their financial house in order? And I think there are a number of important answers to this question that help inform how we can think about the ways in which we can actually help individuals do better, and in which we can help shape public policy in ways that will help individuals do better. So the first reason why individuals don't do so well is that many of them are not particularly financially literate. So the John Hancock Financial Services Company has been conducting a series of surveys every 2 or 3 years for the past 15 years, and they have uncovered some very interesting things. So the first thing is that 38% of the respondents to their survey say that they have little or no financial knowledge. Now, we know that people aren't always accurate in how they answer these surveys, but in this case, there is little reason to doubt that these individuals probably aren't, in fact, very financial literate. 40% of the respondents believe that a money market fund has stocks in it. It doesn't. It has short-term government securities. 2/3 of respondents don't know that it's possible to actually lose money if you invest in bonds. They think you're getting a steady rate of interest and don't realize that they come with prices that go up and down. Respondents on average believe that employer stock, a single stock, completely undiversified, is less risky than a well-diversified stock mutual fund. And as a result, 2/3 of these people say they would be better off working with an investment advisor than if they were in charge of managing their own investments on their own. So that's the first problem, lack of financial literacy. The second problem is that keeping your financial house in order is a complicated task, and it's one that's becoming more complicated over time. So let's consider just a narrow domain of the savings problem: saving in your employer-sponsored savings plan. So in a typical company, you have a choice, which is how much of your money to set aside. So a typical firm would allow you to set aside between 1% and 15% of pay. And then you have to pick an asset allocation. So how are you going to invest that money between, say, 10 or 15 different funds? That would be a typical plan. Harvard University has 259 different funds. Okay, it doesn't sound so bad if you have a degree in business or economics or finance or something like that, but think about this task from the perspective of the individuals I just described, who in fact know very little about how financial markets operate. If you think about all the permutations they have between savings rates, 1% to 15%, and asset allocation, add up your assets between 15 different funds, so it adds up to 100%, there are literally almost an infinite number of possibilities there. Now, just one domain of the problem. Now consider all the different ways that you could possibly save. So there's a picture in Alice in Wonderland of Alice standing underneath the tree with the Cheshire Cat, and there's a signpost off to the side with all the different directions she could go. Now think about labeling that sign, and she's confused. She's out, what should I do? Now think about labeling that signpost with all the different ways that you could potentially save. You could pay off your mortgage early. You could invest in a regular IRA. You could invest in a Roth IRA. You could invest in a regular 401k. You could invest in a Roth 401k. You could invest in a 529 college savings plan. You could invest in real estate. You could buy stocks on your own. You could invest in fancy hedging instruments. The list goes on and on and on and on. So now we've added to the complexity of the task because there are so many different ways that people could save. It's interesting that from a public policy domain, we're actually making the problem worse rather than better. Because over the past 30 years, we've seen a tremendous proliferation in special tax-favored ways to save. So in the past 30 years, the federal government has said, well, you can open a regular IRA, you can open a Roth IRA, you can open a regular 401k, a Roth 401k, a healthcare savings account, a 529 savings plan, and all of these are done with the intention of helping individuals to save more, but in fact, and if you know what you're doing, they can be very useful. On the other hand, if you don't know much about what you're doing, all they do is muddy the landscape, make things more complicated. Okay, a third reason that individuals have problems saving for their needs is that this task often has a lack of immediacy. So there are lots of other complicated tasks that individuals do okay with. So let's take the case of getting a mortgage. So a mortgage is not an easy thing to do, and many people are not experts in getting mortgages. But if you want to buy a house, very few people have enough money to do that without a mortgage. So if you want the house, you've got to figure out how to get one. There's an immediate desire for the gratification of being in your house that helps people overcome and tackle this complicated task. Let's take car insurance, okay? Lots and lots and lots of different car insurance companies, lots of different policies. You know, do I need a little bit of coverage? Do I need a lot of coverage? It's a complicated decision. Once again, why are they able to solve this task? Well, it's because you can't drive legally unless you have car insurance, and that's a big cost. If you want to drive, you have to have the insurance, so individuals have a deadline, essentially, to get that done. How about paying your taxes, okay? Paying your taxes is fairly complicated and gets more complicated every year as well. Why do individuals figure this out? Well, once again, it's because they have a deadline. April 15th, you've got to get it done or you're in trouble. Now think about saving. How many of you have a deadline to save? We don't have any deadlines. Well, if you don't have any deadlines, the task is complicated, it's unpleasant. What do? Well, why do today what you can put off till tomorrow, and individuals end up procrastinating? Okay, a fourth problem is that individuals lack trust in the market for financial experts. So I noted that many people don't have a lot of expertise. Well, there are lots of markets where people don't have expertise. So I'm not a healthcare expert. When I have a health problem, I go to a doctor. I'm not a legal expert. When I have a legal problem, and thankfully I don't have them very often, I go to an attorney. When my car breaks down, I don't know how to fix it. I take it to a mechanic. If I want to, remodel my kitchen, I go find a designer or an architect. And we have markets for experts. They're called financial planners. And for a variety of reasons, many people are very skeptical about using financial help, not the least of which is the fact that often there's what's called an agency problem, that the financial planner is trying to make money off of selling you particular types of investments, and they may or may not give you unbiased advice. And there are a lot of stories going around about people who have been sold products that aren't good for them, and many people are naturally skeptical. So even though in other markets where things are complicated, we have experts that have stepped in to kind of bridge the gap, that hasn't happened very well in financial markets. And then the last reason why I think individuals have a difficult time saving is that we have in fact been making many of the financial investments that people use to save easier and easier to get into over time, in essence allowing people to go raid the piggy bank. So in 1970, only 7% of US households had a credit card. In 2002, 90% of households had a credit card. This allows you, of course, to buy things that you really can't afford today. In 1977, only 5% of homeowners had a second mortgage or a home equity line of credit. In 2004, 19% of homeowners had a second mortgage or equity credit line. So this is a way that allows people to tap into their home equity, perhaps for good reasons, but also perhaps for reasons that they may regret down the road. A traditionally secure form of retirement income has been an employer-provided traditional pension, a defined benefit pension plan, a stream of annuity payments after you retire that lasts until you die. We've got two things that have been going on there. The first is that many employers have stopped offering those because they are risky and costly to offer. The second issue with these types of pensions is that individuals are now increasingly being given the option to take the money out as a lump sum payment, one single very large payment when they retire, rather than as a stream of payments over time. In 1991, only 14% of plans of companies that had defined benefit pension plans allowed their retirees to take the money out all at once. In 2005, that number is 52%, and in companies that allow that option, almost everyone takes it. And then another very popular savings vehicle these days are 401k savings plans. And even there you can raid the piggy bank. So in 1993, only 42% of 401k plans allowed participants to take a loan out against their balances. In 2005, that number is 85%. And across all of the participants in these plans, 20% of them actually have a loan. So what do you get when you combine financial inexperience with complexity, with all of these other factors? Well, you get three things. You get mistakes, you get procrastination, and you get individuals searching for cues, for signals from anywhere about what they should in fact be doing. Now, I don't have time to talk about all of these things, so I'm going to focus in particular on combating complexity, because I think that's a real problem for many people, and I think it's one that we can actually help individuals address. So I've done a lot of research looking at how we can improve savings outcomes in employer-sponsored plans through tackling complexity. So one easy thing that companies have discovered they can do is to automatically enroll people in their employer-sponsored savings plan. If you ask people, do you think you ought to be saving for retirement? Everyone says yes, okay? People want to be doing this. Why don't they get around to doing it? Because they throw up their hands. They don't know what to do. They're confused. Okay, so if they start a company and the employer says, we have a savings plan, but in order to join the plan, you have to fill out this form and pick an asset allocation and decide how much you have to save, you know, a few people would do it tomorrow, and many of them will take 2 or 3 or 5 or some even 10 years, and some will in fact never get around to it. If you just automatically dump them in the savings plan, savings rates go up to between 85 and 98% at all of the various different companies I've studied, which, depending on where they started at, is sometimes a doubling of what was going on in the first place. A second approach is to give people a simple form. So instead of giving them a long, complicated form, give them a simple form. So I did work with one company that sent out a simple mailing to all of their employees who weren't participating in the savings plan, had a little postcard reply form, postage paid. You didn't even have to put a stamp on it. Check this box and send it in. If you check the box and send it in, we will enroll you in the savings plan. And they did this every year for 3 years. They're probably still doing it. Before they did this, if you took a sample of non-participants at any point in time, over the next 3 years, 22% of them would end up signing up for the plan. If you just send them a simple postcard once a year, 3 years in a row, that number doubles to 45%. You're not getting 100%, but I'd say that's a big bang for the buck. A simple postcard once a year for 3 years gets you a doubling in the number of people who are actually saving. Okay, another thing that companies can do is they can send helpful cues to their employees about how much to save. Turns out if you look at a company-sponsored savings plan at how much individuals are actually saving, they seem to adopt very simple rules of thumb. 75 to 80% of them will be saving at a number that's divisible by 5, 10, 15, okay? Or whatever their employer is matching to. Well, this suggests an easy way to help people save more. If you're consider 2 different ways you could match employee contributions. One is you could match 50% of pay up to 6%. So that's 3% total, 50% up to 6. Or 30% of pay up to 10. That's still 3% total. Doesn't cost the company any more money, but guess what happens if you switch from 50% up to 6 to 3% up to 10. People look at that match threshold, how much the employer is matching, the 6 versus the 10, and they say, oh, I can think about that. If the employer is giving a match, that's a no-brainer. I should save that much. And if you increase that number from 6 to 10, they will save 4% more a year. That's an easy thing to do. Another easy thing you can do, companies can do, is they can allow their employees to check a box and increase my savings rate by 1% or 2% of pay every year until I say stop. And in companies that have done that and offered that option, you'll see savings rates quickly double over the course of 3 or 4 years. Now, this is in one simple domain, saving for retirement and company-sponsored savings plans. What I'd like to suggest now are some areas for policy action to help individuals more broadly. So one of the great virtues of employer-sponsored savings plans is payroll deduction. Okay, the money you don't see is the money you never miss. Okay, I always thought it was a puzzle at BYU that you couldn't have payroll deduction for tithing. But that's a very powerful thing. The IRS learned many, many decades ago that tax compliance was much higher if you made employers withhold the taxes when employees were paid, rather than if you paid the employees and then made them pay their taxes at the end of the year. Okay? Payroll deduction is very powerful. So one important public policy question to think about is how can we expand the scope of employees that can benefit from payroll deduction for savings? How can we increase the number of companies that are offering savings plans? So it's typically smaller firms that aren't doing this, either because the regulatory costs are too high or because the employers themselves don't know what to do. We can offer tax credits for doing that. There's a proposal to set up what are called automatic IRAs that will allow small companies to piggyback off of state and federal employee savings plans. Let small employers sign their employees up for those so they don't have to deal with all the administrative infrastructure. Okay, second broad area for policy action is to simplify the savings landscape. So one reason we have all this proliferation of savings vehicles is because we have this funny tax code where some types of savings are tax favored and other types of saving are not. Well, one easy way to get rid of that problem is just make all savings tax favored, and then it doesn't matter which account you choose to put your money in, you get the same tax benefits everywhere. A different approach, and one that President Bush actually proposed, one of his economic policies that actually makes a lot of sense, is to collapse all these various different savings plans into 2 or 3 different ones. He called them lifetime savings accounts. Another area is to find a way to provide individuals with neutral advice. So as I mentioned earlier, people are inherently distrustful of advice because they know that many people providing the advice have their own personal agenda. So find sources that have credibility, that have no hidden agenda, that can provide neutral advice. Improve the disclosure about things that individuals get. The subprime mortgage fiasco is a good example of this. Many people who are in trouble now claim they didn't know, gee, I didn't know my mortgage rate was going to go up 2 or 3 percentage points. Well, guess what? When you signed your mortgage, that information was there. It was somewhere in the 80 pages of forms that you signed. But if there were 80 pages of forms, is it a surprise that people didn't find it? I've done some studies with all sorts of people, including Wharton MBAs, highly educated students, and discovered that they don't even know where to find the information on fees in a 45-page prospectus on a mutual fund. And these are the well-educated people in society. So find ways to disclose information that individuals need in a way that they might actually use it. And then we have bigger problems like Social Security. Social Security is the 600-pound gorilla in the room. And if we don't do something about it today, something will have to be done in the future when it's more costly. In the meantime, people should know they either need to save more today to make up for the benefits cuts they're going to have in the future, or to pay for the tax increase that they're surely going to face. So these are just a few things that I think are important issues for policy action. There's certainly many more things that we can do to help better prepare individuals for the financial hurdles that they will face during their lifetime.
We have just a few minutes for some questions that Professor Maybe would respond to.
Bridget,
Yes.
are there any of the things that you recommended there or would otherwise think of that would particularly impact families? You focus on individuals, and I know they have their family implications. I wonder if you want to tease those out.
Well, I actually don't see much of a distinction between the two of them. I think most individuals are in a family, and when an individual in a family suffers a financial crisis, often the family is brought in as well, not just the immediate family, but brothers and sisters and parents and things like that. So I kind of view them as, for all intents and purposes, mostly the same.
Bridget, you mentioned the example of your husband when he was serving as bishop, which prompts the question, do you think there are differences between a Latter-day Saint population and a general population in the U.S. with respect to the trends or patterns you've seen? Are there any disciplines that members of the church may learn that would be informative both to us but also to the broader community? Or are we just like the rest of the population?
Well, I think in a number of I haven't looked specifically at the financial situation of members of the church, but my general impression is that people in the church are actually not that much different from the rest of the population. I mean, certainly the bankruptcy rate in Utah is not significantly lower than it is other places. Members of the church lose their jobs. One difference is that I think we have a bit of an ethic of calling on family members in a way that may not be shared everywhere else. On the other hand, Mormon families tend to be bigger than other families, so their capacity to help is often not as great. I think one of the things that I think the church could do significantly better at is actually helping to provide information or provide individuals and church leaders with useful information that they can share with others. I mentioned the big surprise for me when my husband was the bishop was how much time he spent helping people with their financial problems. And I'm an economist, so I believe we should specialize. And I would, bang my hands on the table. Why don't they just hire someone to tell people how to get health insurance if you don't have a job, or where to go to sign up for unemployment benefits if you lose your job? And I think we could have a big impact as the university or as the church, either one or collectively, by providing that type of information to people who can use it and can disseminate it to others who can benefit from it.
How do you think you can be, as a visiting fellow at the Wheatley Institute, be more effective in accomplishing the things that you just said are needed in the society that we live in?
Can you say that one more time?
How can you, as a visiting fellow at the Wheatley Institute, be more effective in changing the policy to solve the problems that you just talked to us about?
Boy, that's a loaded question. You didn't tell me I was going to get questions like that. Well, I think there are a number of things that I don't know if you're referring to me specifically, or me as the general me. I think one thing is to try and kind of illuminate where the problems are. Amazingly, 10 years ago, the view in much of the financial services profession was, if we build it, they will come. And that wasn't happening. And it's only been over the past, 7 or 8 years where the large financial services companies have come to recognize that, we need more than just building these great savings vehicles for people. We need to think really about how to help people get into them, and recognizing that, everyone is not a financial expert, and these problems are hard. That was hard for the financial services industry because they don't have a problem. So I think one is to help do research that illuminates what the problems are, and then do the research that helps show how we can solve the problems. And then I think the third is to take the ideas that work and get them implemented, where they're appropriate. And that can be through changing policy. So I'll take a tiny little modicum of credit for helping get the Pension Protection Act passed a little bit over a year ago. I had very minor part of that, but some of my research was influential in some of the provisions in that particular act, helping companies set up better plans, helping institutions like the church or private agencies set up programs that can help individuals. And those require both a strong leader, but also a cadre of helpers to get those things done.
Professor Christensen.
It's wonderful for me to be back here. Humbling to look out to your faces and see so many of you who've had a profound influence on me. Humbling to be by Brother Manson. I left half of my heart at BYU. He taught me Philosophy 110 in the spring of 1971. And I got an A on my final paper from him. And he wrote A, cogent analysis. And I remember then going back to my room in Hinckley Hall and looking up in the dictionary what cogent meant. Wanting to know if it was a compliment or a criticism. And then I've kept that paper with me ever since. Occasionally when I find something that I've got to do that's really hard, I go back and I look at that A from Truman Manson and I think, Clay, if you got an A from Truman Manson, maybe you can do this too. I have spent my academic life trying to understand the problems of managing innovation, and it has not focused on reforming public education in any way. But just in a general sense, if you're running a company, why do you run into so many problems, and how do you solve these things? And little by little, as I publish my general work, people who have studied the problems of why do our public schools struggle to improve, if you can understand that, how would you help them improve faster, have come at me saying, Clay, if you just pick up your research, and instead of studying the problems of education from inside the industry of education, stand on the outside where you are and examine it through the lenses of your work on innovation. Maybe you can see things that others haven't been able to see. And so that's what I've been doing for the last couple of years, is just trying to look through the lenses of general research on innovation. And what I would like to do is just explain two of the simple models that have emerged from the work of myself and my colleagues that have been useful in understanding why our public schools struggle to improve and what to do about them. One of the things we observed is that new technologies or approaches, if they become successful, almost always do so by taking root in undemanding, simple applications at first. And then from that undemanding application, then they improve and little by little get good enough to overtake the mainstream. So think about where Toyota, as an example, came from. They didn't develop their marvelous system by making the most sophisticated cars in the world, but rather they started with the simplest of cars, rusty little Coronas that you may remember on the roads in the 1960s. And they cut their teeth on simple problems and then little by little improved the cars that they were making. And it's a very common mechanism. If you look at the nice high-definition, high-density TVs in your home now, where that technology came from was not by making high-density flat-panel TVs, but rather, remember those flat plastic digital watches that Seiko introduced? That's where the technology first took root, and then little by little it got better and better. And one by one drew the market away from the cathode ray tube into this world. Those companies that thought they could use the technology instantly to make large flat panel TVs spent billions of dollars, and all of them failed. And in a similar way, the transistor was a marvelous new technology that changed consumer electronics forever. If you remember when we were children, most of us, the TVs were made with vacuum tubes by companies like RCA. And these were big machines. The transistor, when it was first developed, couldn't handle the power that was required to be able to use it in making a large television. Every one of the vacuum tube television companies, and these were the giants of the industry like RCA, Zenith, General Electric, Westinghouse, took a license to this transistor technology, took it into their laboratories, and worked on trying to make the transistor good enough that it could be used to make large televisions. They spent in today's dollars nearly $3 billion, and it was all wasted. And how the transistor made it to market was the first application was a tiny little germanium transistor hearing aid. The second application was from Sony that introduced it in this little pocket radio. Those of you with a bit of gray hair, remember how crummy those early Sony radios were? You could buy it for $2. It fit right in your pocket. But Sony chose, rather than sell the radio to people who had big TVs, they sold it to the low end of humanity, people we call teenagers today. And the teenagers were delighted to have a crummy product because it was infinitely better than their other option, which is no radio at all. But then little by little, they got the technology got better and better, essentially competing against non-consumption, until ultimately it got good enough that you could make big radios and TVs with it. And every one of the vacuum tube companies that had spent so much money trying to make a direct head-on attack against the largest and most sophisticated market, they all vaporized. It goes on and on that way. And I want to just leave that model with you. I'll come back to it as a reminder for how computers have been attempted to be used in education and how they need to be used. Generally, we have tried to put the computers right in the classroom, right next to a teacher. And a teacher is a very demanding comparable for a computer. And instead, we need to implement computer-based learning in a different way. Now, the second model that's come from our research is really something that was developed by Professor Kim Clark, who was my thesis advisor. And then a bunch of us have picked up on that work to try to carry it a bit farther. And it relates to the difference in the architecture of products between interdependent products and modular products. And the way to visualize this is if you go back into the years of early mainframe computers, the architecture of those products was interdependent. So the way you designed the operating system depended upon the way you designed the logic circuit, and the way you designed that depended on the way you designed the memory storage, and the way you did that depended upon the way you designed the application software, which depended upon the design of the operating system. Everything depended upon everything. That means you had to do everything to do anything. You had to be a massive, big, integrated company like IBM to play in that game. The hard thing about an interdependent architecture, which is always the case when an industry first gets started, is it's very hard to change or customize an interdependent architecture. You change one thing, you have to change everything. Another good example of an interdependent architecture is the Windows operating system in your computer. And you, if you're writing a piece of software, may wish that you could change Windows just a little bit, because if you can change it, the program that you're writing to run on it would run so much better. But you go up to Redmond, Washington, and knock on the door of Windows and say, would you just let me in, please, because I only want to change 15 lines of code. But they'll bolt the door shut, because if you change 15 lines of code, you've got to change 10 million lines of code. Every line depends upon every other line. If you wanted your own custom version of Windows, it would cost you roughly $2.5 billion to get it. So the economics of an interdependent architecture just mandates standardization, the delivery of one-size-fits-all products, because customization is so expensive. The other kind of an architecture we call a modular architecture, and a way to visualize that is a Dell computer is a modular architecture, just comprised of a bunch of components that fit together according to standardized ways. So you want a new computer, you just log on to Dell.com. Depending on how you feel that day, I think I'll take 2 of those microprocessors, and I'll have Seagate give me 60 gigabytes of memory, and I'll ask Sharp to give me this number of megapixels on my screen. But because the modular architecture has defined how each piece fits together, it's very easy to custom configure the computer to what every customer wants. In operating systems, in contrast to Windows, you may have heard of Linux as an alternative operating system. It's modular. And so all these people out there in the open source world can work on their little piece of it, because the way the pieces fit together is defined by standard interfaces. So if you want your own operating system, you don't even have to knock on anybody's door. You just walk in. So I think I'll take that kernel and I'll embed it right here in my program. And I'll take this one and stick it down there. And the modularity of Linux makes it conformable and customizable to every person's individual needs. Now let me apply these two simple models. The technology typically takes root in simple applications first, and then the model of interdependence and modularity as we view some of the problems in public education. It turns out that the architecture of our public education system is excruciatingly interdependent. You can't study this in 10th grade if you didn't cover this in 8th grade. You can't teach foreign language this way, which would be a much better way to teach foreign language unless you change the way we teach English grammar in 2nd grade. You can't do this here in your classroom because it would require changes at the district headquarters. And you can't teach in a project-focused way because the physical system wasn't set up to do that. So almost every piece of our education system depends upon the way all the other pieces of the education system were designed. And because the economics of interdependence mandates standardization, our public schools are just running pell-mell towards standardizing in the way we teach and the way we test for perfectly rational reasons. The problem with that, though, is it butts head-on into the reality that each of us has a brain that's wired to learn in profoundly different ways. And although the education establishment hasn't agreed on all the terms, it looks like there are about 8 fundamentally different types of intelligence, which means you should never call anybody smart or dumb, because we're all quite smart in a couple of types of intelligence, and we're quite clueless in several others. For example, one type of intelligence is called bodily kinesthetic intelligence. Turns out Michael Jordan is an absolute genius in bodily kinesthetic intelligence. His ability to control his body is actually resident in the way his brain is wired. Ballerinas are geniuses in that type of intelligence. Some others are geniuses in mathematical symbolic intelligence. And as I understood this, I realized when I was in 12th grade physics, Mr. Steve would write this equation on the board. And my best friend, Rob Graves, he'd see that equation and he could just visualize how the whole universe worked. And I'd look at the equation and begin to panic and pray that I'd be able to memorize it long enough to pass the exam. And now I realize Rob wasn't smarter than me. His brain's just wired differently. And the problem is Mr. Steed's brain was wired like Rob's brain. And so the two of them would just sing to each other all semester long. And occasionally he'd look at me and he just couldn't get where I couldn't get it. And what this means, because our brains are all so different, it mandates modularity and customization, because we all need to learn differently. And so we're butting up against the economic demand to standardize in the way we teach versus the critical need to customize to the way each student learns. How do you solve that problem? It's a very difficult thing for a teacher to solve that problem. First of all, it's because most teachers have a brain that's wired in a way that's consistent with the dominant learning paradigm in a particular discipline. Even if we could teach teachers to teach to 2 or 3 different types of brains in the classroom, when they're teaching to one, they're actually not teaching very well to the other. Now, because of all of this, most students in our classrooms aren't learning, and certainly aren't learning very efficiently when we're teaching them. The nice thing about a computer, although a computer has lots of deficiencies, and a teacher has many different things to do as he or she does her work over the course of the school day, one of those jobs that a teacher has to do is an instructional job. And the nice thing about a computer is that it is inherently more customizable, more modular, so that each student could learn if the computer were wired properly in a way that was consistent with the way that student's brain is wired to learn. And so we could teach physics to Clay, whose type of intelligence is association and character. We can teach physics to people who are athletic geniuses and so on. Whereas when we have to teach in a standard one-size-fits-all way, it's very difficult for them to learn. Now, most of the software that's available for learning on computers isn't tuned to help people learn in a way that's consistent with their type of intelligence. But I think of all of the universities in America, Brigham Young University is probably at the lead in this effort. And the question is one by one, we transfer the teaching of different topics to a computer so that teachers can do so many of the other things that they have to do in a school. How do you do it? And this is where the other application or the other model from our research might give us a clue. So remember I said that rarely does technology take root when you target it at the most difficult applications in the market. It almost always starts simple and then improves. And so billions and billions of dollars have been spent putting computers into our schools. But think about where they've been put. They've been put in the classroom with the teacher. And when that happens, never has a teacher said, kids, this is a great day in your lives. You don't need me to give you instruction because you have a computer here. It's never happened. And so the computers have been deployed not to transform the way our students learn, but to augment the traditional learning model, which doesn't customize itself to the way students need. And so computers are there so that students can learn to type. Or they'll use them to check out the internet so that they can write papers, but they've been implemented largely to support and sustain the current instructional model in our schools. The way instead that it needs to take root is just like Sony marketed the transistor, and that is to compete against non-consumption. And actually, if you look at where computer-based learning is taking root fastest, it's in non-consumption. So homeschooling is a huge user of computer-based learning. In small communities that don't have the scope to offer AP tests, they do AP exams by computer, and because the computer is infinitely better than nothing, the customers there are really very happy to have it, and the technology gets better and better. In our community of Belmont, Massachusetts, right next to Cambridge, the school board is just every year in desperate budgetary straits. And so what they do is they just rank order the enrollment in the courses on which standardized exams are not administered. And then the teacher that has the lowest enrollment, they just lop off her head and send out the message, sorry, we just don't have the budget to have German anymore. Sorry, we just don't have budget to have statistics anymore. Sorry, we've got to get economics. And we have quite an affluent suburban community in places like Oakland. The tension with the budget has caused them to lop off pretty much every piece of the curriculum except the core standard topics that are tested in national exams. If we want to bring modular, customizable learning to our students, the way it needs to be done is instead of our schools saying, sorry, we can't afford to have this teacher, they need to add a second sentence to the message. Sorry, we can't afford a teacher, but if you still want to take German, register for the course, and then go to the library that period and log on to apex.com/German and take it online. And although it's nowhere near as good as the teacher who we now can no longer afford, the nice thing about taking it online is the learning can be customized then to the way the student is wired to learn. And then one by one, as we cannot afford a teacher, as we transfer the responsibility for the instructional job to a computer-centric mode, the technology gets better and better, and our ability to teach to the different types of brains gets better and better, until a significant portion of the instructional job in a school is migrated over there. And although a computer seems a little bit heartless and not nearly as good as a teacher, in many ways, what looks like is, rather than teacher-centric learning, is child-centric learning. And it allows the teachers then to spend their time, one by one, helping individual children do a better job learning in a way that their brains are wired to learn. It requires actually that we begin to teach our teachers in a very different way, because the job of a teacher in that world will be very different than the job of a teacher in the world of 20 years ago. Well, it's a very complicated problem. There are millions of dimensions, literally, of the reform of our education system. These are just a couple of concepts that map from our research on innovation to things that we see needing to be done in public education that I thought might be of interest to you. Do you have any catcalls or criticisms or questions for a couple of minutes? Yes.
I'm curious why in education they have based on age basis rather than ability based. All 5-year-olds are not equal, nor 10-year-olds equal. So why do we try to force a round peg into a square hole?
You're exactly right. And the reason is just the interdependent, inflexible nature of the system as it is today. So it's not only that our brains are wired to learn differently, but they can learn at different paces. And when we have to have a one-size-fits-all delivery system, it stretches people beyond what they can do in some cases and holds people back. That's one reason we really need to move towards customization. I agree with you. Dean Magleby, your hand is
Let's
up.
let the PLC go.
Over here.
Professor Christensen, if it's true that you can modularize, or that you think that we could gain from modularizing the education process, wouldn't that also speak to the potential power of the idea of modularizing its funding? Because right now we standardize it by law. Why can we not modularize the funding by law? What that does is then let the parents and the children do what might make sense.
Yeah. You know, I bet you
Is
that,
that off track or what?
no, I think you're right. I bet you that the world will move that way, little by little, as the system evolves. I never thought about that before, but that's a great point. I meant to say one thing while Kim Clark is here. I had a friend who studied accounting at Dixie College, and he just barely passed. But he talked his way into BYU. This is back in the years when you could do this. And he got admitted on probation, and his first semester studying accounting here, he got a 1.0 GPA. So the academic counselor reamed him out, and he said, "What does your dad do?" And he said, "He's a rancher." And the academic counselor said, "I've seen lots of kids, and I think you do better ranching than in university." And it ticked my friend off so bad that he just knuckled down and studied his guts out for the next 18 months. He was a returned missionary. He wasn't horsing around. And he just barely graduated from BYU. And then through some miraculous, he could sell used bubblegum and get rich, this guy, but he talked his way into a Master's of Accountancy program. And again, over the course of 2 years, working 100 hours a week, he just barely graduated. And then it turned out that the instructor of accounting at Dixie College passed away very suddenly just after this guy got his Master's of Accountancy. And with no other options, they called him and said, "You got a Master's in Accountancy. Will you come down and teach this course this semester?" So he went down, and as he was in the position of teaching accounting, all of a sudden, it all became clear to him. Because when he had to teach it, he had to reformat the material that was consistent with the way his brain was wired to learn. And so, of course, he couldn't learn it in an orthogonal way, but as he taught it then, it just became obvious. And one of the most exciting things I think that they're doing at BYU Idaho is creating systems whereby the students teach each other. And I really think, I wouldn't attribute this genius to you, Kim, but whoever was behind it. The genius of it is that as you figure out how to enable the students to teach their peers, they will come to understand the material much better because of that nature that we reformat it before we teach in a way that's consistent with the way our brains are wired to learn. So God bless you with that. I think it's a big opportunity.
Professor Manson.
I noticed that Dean Clark took careful notes on his student and is now leading, both showing great good judgment. Brother Rolf Kerr has confided to me that when President Hinckley invited him in and told him he was calling him as to head up the CES, he spontaneously said, "I'm too old." And then he remembered who he was talking to. I hope you live as long as he does. Mary Lois and Jack, let me begin by doing something he gave me permission to do. He acknowledges that if you look at the campus today and see a glorious forest, you need to acknowledge that the Wheatleys have been responsible for much of that. It's like going through the Mohawk Trail in Massachusetts with wonderful buildings interspersed. 40 years ago, there were buggy whips, trees. Now we have this marvelous growth. And that gives me a starting point because BYU is the three Platonic things. There is truth here, there is goodness here, and there is beauty. All three, and that's glorious. I want to begin with two quotes. All my academic life, I have had in my memory this statement from John Taylor over 100 and something years ago. He said, "You will see the day when Zion," he used that in an inclusive way, I'm limiting it to the education system, "You will see the day when Zion is as far ahead of the world in all matters pertaining to human learning of every kind as it is now ahead in matters religious." That's happening. That's happening under our noses. And the other quote is just one sentence from Elder Widsoe, who taught me way back. He said, quote, "BYU must become Earth's greatest university." We can define or misdefine greatest, but his conviction was that would be inclusive. In all the ways that really define a university, it will become that great. We're on our way. Now you heard brilliantly Elder Wheatley say that he can see both import and export through this new institution. And also that he has for years been associated with the Hoover Institution, where great scholars sometimes retire, but at the peak of their skills are brought in and given facilities and encouragement to do their best work, and then it's sent out. And I foresee that that can happen and will happen here. Can I just quickly list 8 or 10 things that have happened recently that fulfill another prediction that goes back to the Proclamation of the 12, 1845. Paraphrasing, it says that in due time, the cause of the kingdom of God, which, by the way, is more inclusive for Joseph Smith than just this church, but it's the whole network of men of goodwill throughout the world, that the time will come when neutrality will no longer be possible, when the people of the world will either be impressed to one side of the controversy or to the other. And it says that that will happen in the day when this church becomes very visible through both political and religious excitement. Well, the candidacy of a man named Romney has certainly increased the interest and also the speculation throughout the world on who are we. I talked this week to our dear brother who is in charge of visitors here. He says that this building is already too small. That the increase of visitors from all places in the world and from all backgrounds is such that they are taxed to their limit. And that they don't even have time to keep track of and codify the letters that come back of response. The question, he says, that comes up most frequently is, what am I feeling here? There is something different at this university. What is it? Well, of course, we have some deep-rooted answers, but I can remind you of a case in my life where a man from Harvard, and incidentally, the quip in Cambridge, I was back there 2 weeks ago. The quip is, since BYU Business School has now been rated #1 regionally, is that the Harvard Business School is the BYU of the East. Well, I had a man from Harvard who walked around and kept saying it's different, and I gave him some options. No ivy on the buildings. It's the mountains. And by the way, the new Family Science Building on the east side, 3 stories of glass, has a magnificent overview of the mountains. And there will be a display there that's far along that will teach the world that the core of our curriculum is family, and that the core of family for us is Christ. But anyway, he didn't bite on any of those. No, it isn't the ivy. It isn't. Then he finally brightened and said, I have it. No neurotic faces. Now, we no doubt have our share of stresses and strains and neuroses, but compared to what he was familiar with, there are no neurotic faces. And that's the origin, in a way, of what President Faust said of pleasant memory when he described the comment came out of Jerusalem. We're forbidden to say anything about our faith, and yet this merchant who accused this student over and over of doing proselyting finally gave up and then said, yes, but what will we do about the light in your eyes? There is on this campus an increasing radiance, and the Wheatley Institute is to increase that power. Now, I want to name these things very quickly. I know you're ready to go. Here are some recent things that have happened that show that there is extension and expansion, not only of interest, but of serious academic study of the roots of this university. At Claremont College, there will soon be a chair set up in Mormon studies. The first occupant, probably keeping confidences, is one of our prominent historians. He will be utilizing faculty and staff from our institutions, and likewise bringing in other experts and requiring them to do their homework on this tradition. And that sort of homework has begun to be done by various other enterprises, this institution being one. Second is that in Netanya, Jack is interested with his dear wife in the Jerusalem Center, as you've heard, and in the Middle Eastern conflict, which is a mess. There is at a new university called Netanya University on the Mediterranean coast. This is a spin-off of a man who visited here and became conscious of the Mormon relationships to the Holy Land. It is founded on one premise: regardless of the persons in the faculty or administration, whether they are Orthodox Jews or very militant Palestinians, they're all there with one premise: peace. And the quad that enters into that university of about 3,000 students so far requires them to see the Orson Hyde prayer, an actual 4-tree tribute to those who have come from the Mormon Council of the 12 to dedicate the land. And then they become conscious that there is this connection somehow between Judaism and Mormonism. Between heaven and earth, I mentioned quickly. A spin-off of various seminars and symposia that have been held here. Krister Stendhal of Harvard, Frank Cross of Harvard, rabbi from New York and a David Rosen rabbi who's taught for us in Jerusalem all combined their skills and knowledge to talk about ancient temples and how now the Mormons are fulfilling what is in those earlier practices. This film now being shown at temple open houses, shown to couples who can't go in the temple when they're not members, but can now gain access to what we're really about when we build temples. And by the only place I know where there was no severe opposition to building a temple was in Sweden. Why? Because Christer Stendahl, then the Bishop of Stockholm, and a friend of the Mormons through his visits here, said, we will support and pray and honor the Mormons in doing what they're doing in their temples. All this is building bridges instead of walls. The Encyclopedia of Mormonism that you know about is out this month, is on the web. So we have spent money and time to place that encyclopedia in various strategic libraries. Now it is available to everyone on the web. And you've heard downstairs today what's happening in other ways through BYU TV. The Dead Sea Scrolls CD. Here, as a result of our Jerusalem Center, came the Dead Sea Scrolls Project, wanting us to use whatever skills we had in cutting edge of technology to help them with this project. What does it mean? BYU produced a CD, cost about $250. It has on it every fragment and scroll that was discovered in that series of discoveries, so that any scholar can digitize and work with and try to fit together the jigsaw puzzle that will eventually result in something like 30 volumes out of Oxford University. 2 books, Covenant and Chosenness in Judaism and Mormonism, and The Search for Human Nature. These both came out of symposia, one in Jerusalem and one in Denver, involving Mormon and non-Mormon scholars who, again, for the first time, looked seriously and in a comparative way at their own heritage vis-a-vis our own. We have now a library online, and Jack is up to speed on this. It won't be required to create new libraries, Mormon sources, because there's so many of them now available just by punching a button. Steve Covey is here. I just want to mention that we often think of the Middle East situation as hopeless, but when a group came together within the year and followed one basic principle, it comes out of an Indian tradition. I have a stick, and I am now speaking, and I am describing my problems and my perspective on why we hate each other and are killing each other. And until he then hands that to another person who repeats, in his own words, everything he has said to his satisfaction, the discussion can't go on. So understanding must precede any further discussion. And out of that came less defensiveness, greater understanding, and what matters most, respect. And out of that came some decisions and goals on how to resolve the conflict in concrete ways. Well, the institution we're talking about can have a great role in working with that. May I now mention 2 other things and permit deliverance. I have a colleague who has really fallen in love with our tradition. He's written 300 books, co-authored, written, or edited. His position now with a chair at UCal San Diego is in part through the intervention of John Gardner, whose name you know as the university president. He has been here twice, and he's been to the Jerusalem Center twice. He taught Hebrew here for 2 different summers. 2 of the spins off from that have been remarkable. Books on Abraham and others. He said to me one day, I want to establish worldwide, and he's thoroughly well known, this set of 4 principles. I want, first of all, to say to people, you must have a friend who is of an entirely different faith or non-faith than yours. He is your friend. You make him your friend, and you have some contact with him frequently. That's point 1. Point 2, you try to do something good for him and make him aware that you have. even if you have spoken in his behalf and approvingly about your friendship. And he does the same for you. Number 3, over the course of time, you try to put together some resources, and whatever you can afford, you apply to your favorite charity, maybe a charity that benefits your friend. And then he said to me, but you guys, and he was talking about Latter-day Saints and this school, you guys have that built in already. Now he's aware that we have 60,000 plus or minus missionaries out there. He's aware more than most that they wouldn't have gone unless there had been roots of their tradition and values and ethics in the home. And he is aware further that the foundation of our using the home as the base for teaching and influencing ultimately comes to the religious core and ultimately the temples. I find it interesting in passing that we now have a pattern. BYU is here and very close is a temple. The university at BYU in Idaho is about to have a temple. BYU Hawaii has a temple. And I predict that in future the temple buildings there will be other close Mormon institutions and educational systems. Why? So that these can be integrated. And the ultimate reason why we are able to have an honor code and live it is that we make serious covenants in sacred places. And so have our parents. And we have talked seriously about families being united in a way that lasts and lasts forever. No one else quite has that. Friedman knows this and has said, just keep it up. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help. Well, in closing, I'm aware that there are out there in the real world many scholars who can be encouraged to do better work than they're doing if we could invite them here, not just for a quick visit or one stand, but for residence for a while, for some teaching and research. And vice versa, there are an increasing number of Latter-day Saints qualified across the board who can be exported with the support of everyone. If those two processes happen, if we send embers, as it were, from the fire out in the world, and if they in turn, from all sources, come to the fire, we can predict confidently that the purposes that the Wheatleys have sought for will be fulfilled. Thank you very much.
We are very grateful for a number of things, for the generosity that makes this institution possible. We're grateful to be part of it, and we're eager to get started. We want to thank Professor Christensen, Professor Madsen, Professor Madrian. I think this has been a wonderful illustration of the potential of the Wheatley Institution, and we look forward to great things. Thank you all for coming. This is a meeting of which I haven't been a part until now. Is there something else, President, that we need to do?
Probably.
Thank you all for joining, and we'll have a closing prayer. Excuse me. Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me. Lori Spim has been asked. Lori, would you please come up and offer our closing prayer? Thank you.
Our Father in heaven, as we conclude these meetings today, we express gratitude for the things which we have seen and heard and felt in our hearts. we ask now that thou wilt be with us as we dismiss. Wilt thou help us to do thy work